Good morning all. When the government closed the New Zealand border over a year ago, we were clear about our priority, and that was to protect lives. Closing our border was critical to keep COVID-19 out, to keep our economy open and keep New Zealanders safe. And that decision meant that the only people who were able to enter New Zealand were citizens, residents, their partners and children, and others who have been given an exception to the border closure. We have phased in a number of those exceptions over the past year, and the majority have been to bring in critical health workers, research, development and infrastructure workers and critical expertise in our primary sector. But the emergency border closures last March meant some critical health workers who'd planned to have their families follow them had their family members prevented from doing so because of the border closure, which we had to put in place to keep COVID-19 out of New Zealand. Today, we are announcing a new border exceptions, which will reunite hundreds of people caught in that situation, as well as exceptions for a couple of other migrant worker groups caught in the border closures. So, firstly, as of the 30th of April, families of critical health workers will be able to apply for an exception to come to New Zealand. Before our border closed, many healthcare workers were able to bring their families with them when they moved to New Zealand. Those arriving as critical health workers since the border closed have also been able to bring their families. But since COVID hit last year, Immigration New Zealand hasn't been able to process visa applications for people offshore unless they have a border exception. The change we're announcing today will allow Immigration New Zealand to process offshore visa applications once again for those critical health workers who had left family at home overseas when our emergency border closures came into force. The new exceptions will also allow a small number of other highly skilled workers who are in New Zealand on temporary visas to apply for an exception to bring their families here without having to leave New Zealand to go and collect them. This will ensure we can continue to retain highly skilled temporary workers necessary for New Zealand's economic recovery. And a new border exception is also being created for the families of temporary visa holders in New Zealand, where their family members hold visas but had not yet arrived in New Zealand when the border closed last year. To be eligible for all of these new border exceptions, the family members who are currently in New Zealand must have more than 12 months remaining on their visa. In the past year, we have introduced exceptions that have allowed entry for around 13,000 family members of New Zealand citizens and residents and 1,300 temporary work visa holders and their families who normally live here and were overseas when the border closed. More than 2,500 family members of critical workers have also entered to date. Overall, in the past year and under COVID border controls, we have been able to bring in more than 130,000 people through our MIQ system, the overwhelming majority having been returning New Zealanders with a right to come home. The government has been clear that our decisions on giving people an exception to our closed border has to balance the needs of many industries and sectors, as well as social, cultural and humanitarian objectives. And we have always said that as safe capacity allowed, we would consider what additional groups might be able to come in. These latest exceptions are expected to allow hundreds more migrants to come to New Zealand and join their families. And families will need to go through the border exception process, the visa process, and then secure an MIQ space. So it may still be another few months before these families are reunited, but we hope this provides more certainty for them. We will continuously review our border exceptions and we may consider further changes at a later date, depending on MIQ demand, the situation with COVID globally, and levels of infection we find coming into managed isolation. It is important that we stagger these new exceptions to minimise the impact on MIQ and continue to allow New Zealanders to come home. No one has been immune from the difficulties of COVID, which has kept families apart all over the world. It has changed the way that everyone has to live. We absolutely acknowledge that there will be still some people having to live in difficult situations because of the border closures. And this is why the government will continue to be mindful of these situations as we safely work through our border-related decisions.